With Jujutsu Kaisen chapter 245, we're a little all over the place here, but in a really good way. We left off the last chapter thinking we were going to see Sukuna being put on trial in this chapter, and while this does happen, we did think that the chapter will open up with that being the focus here, but instead, Gege takes the opportunity to once again subvert expectations by shifting the scene once again to another location on the battlefield, like he did when he shifted to Kenjaku versus Takaba, when we thought that we were going to be getting Yuji and Higaruma versus Sukuna. So we open up the chapter with Hakari versus Urame taking place, continuing where we left off with them last, where Hakari was distracting Urame previously following the battle with Kashimo, and that battle of fire versus ice, it doesn't disappoint at all. After Hakari is hit with an attack that appears to freeze the entire upper half of his body, you think for a second Hakari is done for, but then we see that Urame has miscalculated when he destroys part of Hakari's body that is frozen, but Hakari goes from missing a limb to all of a sudden his limbs have regenerated, and he grabs Urame by the face and sends him flying through a building, and with this next attack he's got the upper hand, and that's where we start seeing some high praise from Urame in regards to Hakari. So this pretty much implies that during the battle that happened off screen, that Hakari pretty much hit the jackpot during that battle, and when that happens, as we all know, Hakari is the definition of being unkillable due to how his domain expansion works. Urame states that in this one area, his method of using reverse curse technique in order to heal himself has pretty much placed Hakari over both Satoru Gojo and Sukuna himself, which is absolutely insane. And while it can be easy to say that this is Urame just hyping up Hakari, I don't think that this is the case at all. Like, the foreshadowing's been there for a while. So if you go back to the early parts of Jujutsu Kaisen, when Gojo thinks that Yuji Itadori is dead, Gojo talks about the young and up-and-coming sorcerers who he thought that had all the potential to be on his level one day, maybe even potentially surpass him, with Yuta and Hakari being right there when he was talking about this, and we see their silhouettes as he's thinking to himself and speaking out loud about their potential. This is merely Gege Akutami playing the long game and finally paying off that line, which should have been clear from the moment we saw how cracked Hakari's domain expansion is, but it's almost like Gege is saying like, hey, you might have been sleeping on this guy, you might want to pay more attention right now. Throughout this battle, we continuously see Hakari continue to heal his wounds at speeds that alarm Urame and leave him shocked and quickly getting annoyed, because what he might have thought was going to be a quick battle quickly escalated into being something else altogether. And it's because, again, Hakari is unkillable right now. Hakari isn't just holding his own against Urame, but he's actually putting up quite a bit of pressure on him, and Urame isn't some bottom of the rung jujutsu sorcerer either. Urame is pretty damn good. Sukuna wouldn't let just anyone get that close to him, but despite all of this, Hakari just drop kicks Urame and sends him flying through several buildings with the force of his attack. This leads to Urame collecting himself and recomposing himself, all while having his old man or old woman yelling at clouds moment, depending on what gender you think he is, basically saying that back in my day things used to be like this, but this current generation, they're completely soft. Goes on this long-winded monologue about how modern sorcerers are concerned with keeping up appearances and being human, and states that having such concerns actually makes them weak, that humans, the nature in of itself is the weakness that comes from fearing loneliness, which is in a way very ironic. Jujutsu Kaisen as a series has shown us irony in the form that those who are the strongest appear to be some of the most loneliest among us all, because their power sets them apart from others. Gojo and Geto were close in strength for a while until they weren't, and then the divide just grew. Kashimo was the strongest during his period of time when he was alive, but he was also lonely. Sukuna right now, he's the strongest, but deep down inside he's still lonely, despite there being people like Yorozu and Urame who in their own ways are always trying to be there for him. That's why Gojo's like, man, my fist couldn't reach him. Loneliness isn't just the weakness that comes from the fear of loneliness. It's something that the strong suffer from because of that. They're strong. The top is always so much better than the bottom, but the top is also lonely because there's only so much space at the top. However, as Urame continues to speak, he finally gets to this point and he says that he's going to change his perception of Hakari and stop viewing him as a human being and focus solely on crushing him, which is an acknowledgement of Hakari's strength and a sign that he's living up to the potential that we were told he had. This leads to Hakari getting his fighting spirit super boiled up and he's ready for this fight of his life, but just when you think think we're going to continue on this battle between these two, where there are going to be clear philosophical undertones being sprinkled into it. The subverting of our expectations happens yet again. Gege shifts to a courtroom scene, and we pick up where the last part left off, and this is where we get the most Sukuna thing ever. The guy basically already knows what's going on due to having already experienced Higaruma's powers back before when Yuji was put on trial and was trying to kill him, and he's already thinking about the end game, the executioner's sword that will kill whoever it is it cuts. But we'll get to that in a moment, because Sukuna's wit gets us to this moment, and it's in the most brazen as well as some of the most Sukuna-like things that you would ever expect. Judgment begins holding court for the Shibuya massacre that Sukuna carried out, and Higaruma reveals that the true person on trial for that massacre will be none other than Sukuna, which he isn't wrong here. It was Yuji's body that did all the killing and leaving behind all those dead bodies all over the place, but it was Sukuna controlling him. On a moral argument level, Yuji isn't the one responsible, but that leads us to Higaruma thinking that he's basically won, and he begins to lay out all the rules for how his domain works. But Sukuna basically says, spare me the long-winded explanation. I already know how this works. I went through this when I was inside of the kid. He knows the evidence that Higaruma has is damning. Higaruma is basically practically smiling when he gets the evidence, because it's more than enough to get a conviction. And like a typical lawyer, he's already thinking about how Sukuna might try to appeal this decision by pleading some form of mental illness, but Sukuna isn't planning for any of that. The guy flat out says, I'm interested in that damn sword and just get on with it. Basically a guilty confession, which is exactly how Judgment takes it, as a confession. And Sukuna is grinning when this happens, which if you're Higaruma, you have to question yourself. We just got a death penalty and confiscation, so why does Sukuna look so excited right now? Sukuna looks like I would look if Liv Morgan pulled up to my house right now and said, you, me, bedroom right now. The same way I would be filling out child support papers on the spot. Sukuna looks absolutely excited about what's about to come. Meanwhile, as Higaruma is preparing his sword, we learn that the next stage of Angel's plan is in play here, because we learn that the other sorcerers from Jujutsu High are about to spring into action. So we're getting ready to either get another swerve, or we're going to get more Sukuna victims being put on full display. Sukuna sees the executioner's sword being drawn, and the guy looks like Santa Claus just gave him his favorite toy for Christmas. And as this is going on, someone is narrating or speaking to Higaruma the question of, does he want to die? And that leads to Sukuna acting and using his cursed ability. So the reason being is that Sukuna had already figured out his way around the entire situation. Higaruma's domain expansion, the rules didn't take away his cursed technique because he had a cursed weapon. So the weapon itself was taken away, and I find it fitting when you look at it, because Higaruma's whole domain expansion, it is a courtroom. Weapons are not allowed by people on trial or non-court staff unless they are the deputies who are guarding the courtroom. Weapons aren't allowed. So of course, confiscation would take the item that would be Sukuna's weapon, which is why he was able to use his curse technique to get the drop on Higaruma, because it takes the item, not the curse technique. It can only take one of them based on what we've seen. And at the last minute, after Higaruma gets that premonition about his death, that's when you have Kusakabe show up. But given that Higaruma is going against Sukuna, all this likely did was delay his death, and we have to start preparing ourselves for the very real possibility that Sukuna is going to get the executioner's blade as a weapon. That in of itself is very scary, because it doesn't matter who you are. If that sword cuts you, you are dead. In theory, it could have killed Gojo. If Sukuna had all 20 fingers and was at full power, if he got hit by it, he'd be dead. It does not matter. This would also line up what we saw when Kenjaku versus Takaba took place. Kenjaku was highly interested in Higaruma, and we can see that Sukuna is interested as well, and it's all because of this sword. If this isn't the strongest implication that the sword can be taken by Higaruma and you can gain possession of it, I don't know what is. The two big bad guys of the arc in the series, Sukuna and Kenjaku, they are interested in Higaruma, so there's a chance that the sword might be able to be used outside his domain, which we're about to see because the domain is now over and he's holding the sword. Now, if you're still a little confused about how Higaruma and Hakari's domain expansions work, you'll want to check out my every domain expansion video that you see here on the screen.